I was halfway to my car when the patrol vehicle cut across the lane and stopped at an angle. No lights, no siren, just enough to block the driver's side of another vehicle. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out before the door fully closed. He didn't rush. One hand rested near his belt. The other swung loosely. He was chewing gum. Slow and steady. Like nothing here required urgency. The man he approached, Richard Hale, was already seated in a wheelchair beside an open trunk. Grocery bags were lined up in clean rows on the asphalt. Nothing spilled. Nothing hurried. Brooks didn't announce himself. He didn't ask if help was needed. He stopped close. Close enough that the front wheel of the chair sat between his boots. From where I stood, I could see the body camera on Brooks's chest. It was mounted and visible, but untouched. The interaction had already started anyway. He did not reach for it. Richard kept his hands flat on his thighs. Still, deliberate. His posture didn't change when Brooks spoke. Brooks asked what Richard was doing there. Not casually. Not conversationally. The kind of question that doesn't narrow anything down. The answer came calmly. Groceries. Leaving soon. Brooks didn't step back. His eyes moved past Richard's face and settled on the cane resting against the wheel. He looked at it longer than he had looked at the license a moment later. The ID came back. But the distance did not change. Brooks asked for identification. Richard nodded once and said he was going to reach for it. He moved slowly. Exactly as announced. Wallet out. License handed over. Brooks read it longer than necessary. His lips moved slightly as he repeated the name. He asked follow-up questions that didn't clarify anything. Where do you live? Do you live nearby? Answers were given. General. Non-provocative. Brooks's posture stayed the same. His attention returned to the chair. Not to Richard. To the equipment. He asked what happened to him. The response was brief. An injury. Another question followed. Sharper and more personal. Richard declined to elaborate. Brooks leaned closer. When Richard said the injury came from work, Brooks repeated the phrase. Line of duty. Asked what kind. Federal law enforcement. Retired. Brooks let out a short laugh. Not loud. Just enough to register. He scanned Richard again. The coat. The arms. The chair. The cane. Then he issued the instruction that shifted the scene. Stand up for me. Richard didn't react immediately. When he answered, his voice stayed level. He said he couldn't. Brooks treated that as resistance. He questioned the chair without touching it. Questioned the injury without evidence. Questioned the need for the cane without asking what it was for. Footsteps behind me slowed. A cart stopped rolling. Several phones were lifted. The movement around us paused. But Brooks did not. Richard said he couldn't stand because that was why he used the chair. Brooks replied that Richard didn't look paralyzed. No raised voice. No profanity. Just doubt stated as fact. When Richard objected, Brooks ignored him and reached down. He picked up the cane without asking. Turned it once in his hand. Testing the weight. It doesn't look medical to me, Brooks said. Brooks spoke into his radio while still holding the cane. He used short phrases. Object. Secured. He did not look at the camera when he said it. Richard remained seated. His hands had not moved. A woman near the storefront said the obvious. That Richard was in a wheelchair. Brooks told her to stay back. Another voice called out for Brooks to turn his camera on. It's already on, Brooks replied. The camera stayed untouched. Then Brooks tossed the cane aside. Not back toward the chair. Away from it. Far enough that it couldn't be reached. Richard looked down. Then back up. You just took away my support, he said. Brooks didn't respond. He ordered Richard to keep his hands visible. Ordered him not to lean. Ordered him to stay exactly as he was. Without the cane, Richard adjusted slightly in the chair. Nothing abrupt. Nothing forward. Just enough to stay upright. Brooks placed his palm on Richard's shoulder seam and pressed him back into the seat. The pressure lasted less than a second. Richard told him not to touch him. Brooks leaned in and said quietly, You sure you didn't just forget how to walk today? No shouting. No slur. just enough for everyone nearby to hear. That was when a second patrol car pulled in behind Brooks's vehicle. Officer Ethan Cole stepped out. And that was when the scene stopped being contained. Officer Ethan Cole stopped short when he stepped out of the second patrol car. Not dramatically, just enough to register what was in front of him. Richard Hale was still seated in the wheelchair. The cane lay several feet away, flat on the pavement where it had landed. Officer Daniel Brooks stood close, positioned slightly behind the chair now. One hand resting on the backrest as if it belonged there. Nothing moved for a moment. Cole's eyes went first to Richard, then to the cane, then back to Brooks. His hand hovered near his radio, touched it once, then dropped. Brooks spoke before anyone else could. His voice was firm and quick, the kind used to set a frame. "He's been uncooperative." Richard turned his head slightly toward Cole. His voice stayed even. He said that wasn't true. Brooks cut him off without raising his volume. He told Richard not to speak. Cole didn't respond right away. He looked around instead at the small group that had formed. The phones were still held up, at the open trunk with the groceries still untouched. Then he spoke. Slower. Asked what was going on. Brooks answered in short pieces. Object. Safety. The subject is not complying. He gestured toward the cane without picking it up again. Richard said Brooks had taken it from him. Cole glanced down at it once more. He didn't touch it. From where I stood, there were now 2 uniforms, 2 radios, and 1 seated man. Brooks was still closest to Richard, still controlling the distance. Cole suggested slowing things down. Brooks didn't agree or refuse. He just kept talking, adding details, repeating that he'd established control, that he'd followed procedure. Richard stayed seated. His hands were still visible. He didn't argue beyond correcting what had already been said. A few minutes passed like that. No shouting. No sudden movement. Just the sound of radios chirping and a low conversation between Brooks and Cole that didn't include Richard. Then another vehicle pulled in. A dark SUV this time. Sergeant Laura Mitchell stepped out. She didn't hurry. She didn't scan frantically. She took in the whole scene in one slow sweep. The chair. The cane. The distance between Brooks and Richard. The crowd. She asked what they had. Brooks spoke immediately. Faster than before. Argumentative subject. Refused commands. Object within reach. Mitchell looked at the cane on the ground. That object? She asked. Yes. Ma'am. Brooks said. I secured it. Richard spoke before she turned fully toward him. He said it was his mobility cane. That Brooks had taken it. Mitchell raised one hand slightly. Not a command. Just enough to pause the exchange. She told Richard she'd get to him. Then she asked Brooks a different question. Why is it on the ground? Brooks opened his mouth, then closed it. He said safety. Mitchell didn't respond to that right away. She looked at Richard more closely now. His posture, the way he was holding himself in the chair. She asked if he needed medical attention. Richard didn't hesitate. He said yes. His shoulder and his back. Brooks objected. He said that wasn't necessary. Mitchell turned her head just enough to look at him. She said she would decide that. That was the moment authority moved up a level. Mitchell called for medical assistance. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just into her radio. Like it was the next step in a checklist. Brooks stepped back half a pace. Not much. But it was the first time he'd created distance since he arrived. Paramedics arrived a few minutes later. They knelt beside Richard and asked him basic questions. He answered clearly. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't editorialize. When one of them touched his shoulder, Richard inhaled sharply and said it hurt. The paramedic looked up at Mitchell and said they should transport. Mitchell nodded. As they prepared the stretcher, Mitchell stepped aside with Brooks. They spoke quietly, just out of Richard's earshot. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see Mitchell glance at the body camera on Brooks's chest. She pointed at it once, then at the cane. Brooks shook his head slightly. He said something short in reply. Mitchell didn't argue. She just looked back at the scene and then spoke into her radio again. Richard was transferred carefully onto the stretcher. The cane was picked up this time, placed alongside him, not returned to his hand, but no longer abandoned on the ground. As the ambulance doors closed, the crowd began to thin. Phones lowered. Carts started moving again. But the scene didn't end there. Brooks remained standing beside his patrol car. His posture was different now, less forward, more contained. Cole stood a few steps away, watching without speaking. Mitchell stayed long enough to give final instructions. Not dramatic, just procedural. Before she left, she said something to Brooks that made him look down for the first time since I'd been watching. The vehicles pulled away, one by one. The ambulance first, then Mitchell's SUV, then Cole's unit. Brooks was the last to leave. As he got back into his car, he finally reached up and touched the body camera. By then, the moment it would have recorded had already passed. And the record that mattered was no longer being written at the scene. The ambulance pulled away first. Its doors closed without urgency. No lights. No siren. Just the sound of the engine faded as it cleared the lot. Officer Daniel Brooks remained beside his patrol car. He didn't speak. He didn't move much either. His posture was contained now. Shoulders squared. Eyes forward. Officer Ethan Cole stood several steps away. Watching without comment, Sergeant Laura Mitchell stayed long enough to give final instructions, then left the scene the way she had entered it without emphasis. By the time the last vehicle pulled out, the parking lot had returned to its normal rhythm. Carts rolled again. People walked past without stopping. The groceries that had been lined up so neatly were gone. But the scene didn't end there. It moved. At the hospital, the sequence was basic and repeatable. Measurements, notes, photographs, times recorded. Bruising was documented along the upper arm. Shoulder strain noted. Back pain attributed to sudden movement while seated. Each detail is entered quietly into a system that doesn't ask why first. It asks when. Richard Hale asked for a phone. He made one call. Short. No explanation needed. By the next morning, an internal review had already been opened. The body camera footage was pulled. Not clipped. Not summarized. The full file, dash camera footage from the 2nd Patrol Unit was added. A video recorded by bystanders began circulating online and was then archived. Audio from the radio traffic was synchronized with the footage, frame by frame. The first inconsistency was simple. In Officer Brooks's written report, the word weapon appeared more than once. The cane was described as an object that posed a potential threat. In the video, no one treated it that way. Not until it was taken. The second inconsistency followed. The report described Richard as uncooperative and agitated. The footage showed him seated the entire time. Hands visible. Movements minimal. Corrections were offered only when statements didn't match what had happened. The timing didn't align. Descriptions appeared in the report before the behavior they were meant to justify. Commands were recorded after compliance had already occurred. Control was described before it was ever formally established. At that point, the file stopped being controlled at the scene. There was no press release announcing it, no statement, no spokesperson. The transition happened quietly. Through requests sent and files transferred, every record associated with Daniel Brooks was pulled. Training history, prior complaints, use of force reports, evaluations. None of them stood out on their own. Taken together, they formed a pattern that had never quite been locked into place before. This time, it was Richard's background was verified next. Federal service. Retired. Injury sustained during an interagency operation years earlier. Medical documentation matched. No prior complaints. No criminal history. Someone who understood exactly how authority works when it stays inside the record, and how it fails when it doesn't. Daniel Brooks was placed on administrative leave. He told colleagues the situation had been misunderstood. The footage didn't show the whole picture. That Richard had been argumentative. That everything had become political. None of that changed the timestamps. The indictment came sealed. No announcements. No early leaks. Every charge is tied to specific moments on the timeline. Each is supported by video, audio, and written contradiction. When federal agents arrived at Brooks's home weeks later, there were no sirens, no neighbors gathering, 2 men in plain clothes, badges shown, a brief statement of charges under federal civil rights statutes. Brooks asked if he could call a lawyer. He was told yes. By midday, the department issued a short notice confirming that an officer had been arrested pursuant to a federal warrant. His badge was confiscated. His weapon was logged as evidence. All system access was terminated before the afternoon shift began. He was no longer an officer. In court, the process remained quiet. The prosecution didn't begin with an argument. The first instruction to the jury was simple. Watch the video. They watched the footage from the moment Brooks stepped out of his patrol car to the moment Richard was placed on a stretcher. No edits, no commentary, no narration. They saw the distance, the positioning. The way Brooks stood was too close. The moment the cane was taken, the brief pressure on the shoulder, the statements that didn't match the actions. They heard the line clearly, the one spoken without volume, without urgency. Expert witnesses testified afterward. A use of force instructor explained that nothing Richard did met the threshold for detention, let alone force. A disability rights specialist stated that there is no lawful basis to demand proof of disability or remove assistive devices during a routine encounter. When Richard testified, he did not raise his voice. He described the injury that put him in the chair. The training taught him how to move carefully. The moment his balance shifted when the cane was taken away. I don't expect special treatment, he said. I expect the procedure to be followed. Daniel Brooks testified as well. He said he felt unsafe. The cane could have been used as a weapon. The prosecutor paused the video and asked him to point to the moment where that fear became reasonable. He didn't answer. The jury deliberated briefly. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all federal charges. At sentencing, the judge did not raise her voice. You used authority without record, she said. And when the record arrived, it contradicted you. 9 years in federal prison. Permanent revocation of certification. Complete termination of a law enforcement career. No applause followed. A civil settlement was finalized separately. No admission of wrongdoing on paper. Just a number. Restitution recorded. Weeks later, the department announced a new disability rights training program. Brooks's name was removed from the personnel roster. There was no ceremony, no statement of regret. The video remained online, not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. A routine encounter, a decision made before it was written down, a record that arrived late, but not too late. When power is forced into the record, it stops being discretionary. If you want more real cases where authority is examined step by step, follow Power Abuse Stories.